In the last hour, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said he's prepared to meet Russia's Vladimir Putin for talks in Istanbul on Thursday, after President Trump appeared to hit out at Ukraine and urged Mr. Zelensky to agree to talk with Russia immediately. In a post on X, the Ukrainian president also said that he expected a full ceasefire to start on Monday in order to provide the necessary basis for diplomacy to end the war. And I will be waiting for Putin in Turkey on Thursday, personally, he added. Earlier, in a post on his Truth Social platform, President Trump said President Putin of Russia doesn't want to have a ceasefire agreement with Ukraine, but rather wants to meet on Thursday in Turkey to negotiate a possible end to the bloodbath. Ukraine should agree to this immediately. He went on to say at least they will be able to determine whether or not a deal is possible. Vladimir Putin offered direct talks in Istanbul in a TV address in the early hours of Saturday morning. We'll be live in Washington shortly, but first with me is our World Affairs correspondent Joe Inwood. Do we think Thursday will actually happen in some form?
Oh, that is a very, very good question. We know from the Russians that they've offered these talks. They say that someone will be there. President Trump then says, as you were just mentioning, the talk should happen. And within minutes, we were speaking an hour ago, and between now and then, President Zelensky has come out on social media and said, I'll be there personally. And this is the really interesting thing here. President Putin never said he was going to be taking part in these talks. And previously, talks have happened at a lower level. I think it was Sergei Lavrov that took part in the last ones, which were in Istanbul in 2022, so more than 3 years ago. President Zelensky said, I'll be there personally. I'll see you there, Putin. Which obviously, that wasn't part of the agreement. He then says, I hope the Russians don't look for excuses. So we've got this kind of, not say game, but this kind of battle between the two men of what they're offering to do to try and paint themselves, it seems, in the eyes of Donald Trump, because that really is one of the key things in this, as the person who is happy to look for peace.
If we saw Zelensky opposite Putin across the table, it would be a big moment, wouldn't it?
It would be extraordinary.
What would they talk about? Because, you know, all the indications are they're still so far apart.
Yeah, I mean, if that were to happen, and I would not expect, I won't be waiting to see the two men across each other from a table on Thursday. If it does, fair enough, but I will be astonished if it does. In terms of the talks, as you say, they've both got these red lines that seem absolutely miles apart. President Putin has always talked about trying to end what he calls the root causes of this war. Now, if you think about what he's talking about, really, it's political independence, the sovereignty of Ukraine. He wants to go back to a time when Ukraine was under the Russian umbrella, the USSR umbrella. He wants to have a compliant government in Kyiv. He also, at the very least, wants to take over a large amount of Ukrainian territory, not just the bits they've already captured since 2014, since 22, but actually a bit more they've originally asked for. All of those are hugely unacceptable to Ukraine. For the Ukrainian perspective, they want their territory back. They've talked before about war reparations. They've even talked about getting all of the Crimean Peninsula back and the territory they lost in 2014. So completely polar opposites in terms of what they want. And whether any negotiators can find a way to find middle ground, I mean, it will be the most difficult of international negotiations.
All right, Joe, thank you. We will await Thursday with interest. Well, we can cross live now to Washington to speak to our North America correspondent, Jake Kwan. Jake, you've been hearing the developments in the last hour with this and Zelensky's response. What do you think Donald Trump will make of this then? Because he was urging them to get to the table, wasn't he? He's prepared to call out both sides at different times.
Certainly. If you look at his post that you were just showing earlier, he is, it's usually riddled with the all caps. The message is very clear. The meeting must happen now. And he wasn't only pressuring Zelensky to have the meeting. He was going after both Zelensky and Putin, saying that, it seems that maybe Zelensky is not willing to do it. Putin also seems distracted by his VE parade, but that they must meet. And both leaders, it really benefits them to look like they're not standing in the way of the peace deal that Mr. Trump desperately wants. And Mr. Trump, you can read from that his patience seems to be running thin. And there's this one part in that post saying that if not, Europeans and U.S. will know where everything stands and can proceed accordingly. He is bringing a little bit of that Godfather-like energy, kind of a thinly veiled threat that he could turn the screws on. He could bring extra pain if these people do not play the way he likes.
You know, I think one theory from analysts is that Putin has thrown out the possibility of these peace talks on Thursday because he's playing for time, but actually intends to continue the war, to continue his military actions. And the suggestions are that Donald Trump gets played by Putin. What do you think the White House make of that?
Certainly, that is a fear that White House has, and the doubt that White House does share with Kyiv somewhat. And he was saying earlier that perhaps Putin is simply tapping him along, playing him for a fool. But Mr. Trump is really going for the prize here. He just won this great prize of victory in India and Pakistan issue. He could point that as his first kind of win, and he wants a second one. He really wants to wrap this up. And if Mr. Putin does not play by Mr. Trump's rules, he could really bring in these other threats that he has mentioned earlier, like more sanction on the banking system and the really painful secondary sanctions that he mentioned earlier, where the U.S. could put sanctions on any countries, any companies that does deal with Putin, which Moscow surely would love to avoid.
Jake Kwon, thank you. Let's speak now to Sergei Goryashko from the BBC's Russian service, who is in Riga. Sergei, thank you for joining us. We heard President Putin's announcement made in a 2 a.m. press conference in Russia, didn't we, in the early hours of this morning. What do you think we can understand about his intentions?
Well, he had to respond somehow to the proposition of a 30-day ceasefire, and he did, ultimately rejecting this idea. And he had to come up with some sort of an counter-proposition, some sort of another measure, and which is why he asked about those negotiations in Istanbul and said that Russia is ready to negotiate with Ukraine without any conditions and just to take it from there. It was not the first time when Vladimir Putin has told that he is ready to a direct negotiation with Kyiv, but actually before he always added something like Vladimir Zelensky has already banned himself from the negotiations, which is why these negotiations are not possible. This time he didn't mention these facts, and this time he said that Russia is ready to negotiate in good faith. And but of course, ultimately, the positions of Moscow and Kyiv are somehow very different now. And another interesting fact that just minutes after Putin has concluded his speech, the first drones since that ceasefire announced by Russia during the Victory Day, the first drones hit Ukrainian soil. There were a swarm of hundreds of them sent from Russia to Ukraine.
Do you get any sense of people's reactions within Russia to Putin's latest offer of peace talks? What kind of response does it get from the public there?
Doesn't seem much response at the time, but of course everyone is, it's a nail-biting week. Well, everyone will be watching who will go to Istanbul, who will represent Russia at the time, and which conditions Russia would have at those negotiations. Vladimir Putin mentioned the earlier Istanbul talks back in 2022, but since then the situation has changed dramatically. Well, for once, Russia has annexed the parts of 4 Ukrainian regions, and during Istanbul talks in 2022, that was not the case at the time. And there was the idea that the fate of Donbas and Crimea would be discussed by presidents directly, and the status of the Crimea Peninsula would be somehow not discussed during the next 2 decades. Now the situation and the Russian position has changed, and they will definitely add something up about that in their starting positions.
OK, Sergei, thank you for your thoughts on that.